if you want a stable Middle East, it has to come at the negotiating table. I'm sorry, but people don't quite, for whatever reason, they resist that notion. But that is where this happens, because in the end, people might have to come to the table because of the bombs and the pain and things that they're experiencing. But if they don't have a say in their future, that kind of security will not last.
Welcome to this special episode of Making Peace Visible. I'm your host, Jamil Simon. The world is missing the perspective and active participation of peacebuilders at a critical moment. As we live through this time of one war after another, we need skilled negotiators and mediators who know how to listen to both sides of a dispute and find common ground. Instead, we have an administration in the United States that prefers to dictate terms rather than negotiate them. Today, we have the good fortune to be talking to a skilled negotiator, peace builder, and mediator who has studied negotiation from every conceivable angle. Joshua Weiss is an internationally recognized conflict resolution expert, educator, and author. He co-founded the program on negotiation at Harvard with William Ury. He also directs the Masters in Leadership and Negotiation program at Bay Path University and runs a private consulting firm. After decades of working with governments and institutions around the world, Josh has even written a book that could be useful to the current administration today. His book is called Getting Back to the Table: 5 Steps for Reviving Stalled Negotiations. I spoke with Josh on March 25, 2026. In the following days, there were some more developments, including new countries involved in negotiating a potential ceasefire or peace agreement. I'll share an update from Josh at the end of the interview. How can negotiations function in this strange new world? Is there hope for de-escalating conflict? Josh, welcome back to the show. I hope you can shed some light on these questions at this fraught moment.
Thanks, Jamil. It's always a pleasure to be with you, and I'll do my very best. It is a fluid situation. There's a lot of moving parts, but I think it's important more now than, at other times to really be clear about what's going on, what's happening, the kind of overtures that are transpiring behind the scenes and things like that. So happy to do my best to give my own analytical point of view and where I think things might head. Although playing Nostradamus in the Middle East is fraught with all kinds of challenges, so I'll be careful there as well.
Right, it is. The last time you were here on the podcast was almost 4 years ago. We invited you to speak about a very special initiative, the Abraham Path, that you co-founded to build walking trails in the Middle East that connected communities. And at that time, the Abraham Path initiative was building trails in the mountains of the Kurdistan region of Iraq. It struck me as we were preparing up for our conversation today, Iraqi Kurdistan is now a front in this new war. Have you been able to communicate with your local partners, the tour guides and the people who offer lodging to travelers?
We have. In fact, we've been in constant communication with them. I was actually just out in Turkey and Kurdistan in October. And it was quite a place. It's absolutely stunning, beautiful. And like many places in the region, that beauty is wrapped in pain, where a lot of the fighting between the Kurds and Saddam took place. But it was one of those kinds of places where you thought, wow, this is really extraordinary. And if there ever was sort of calm, it could become a world-class walking and traveling route that connects people. And we've been in touch with folks. They have shared with us their experiences of missiles falling and power outages and the fear that they're experiencing. We're doing our best to try to raise some resources to help them during this time. But it's difficult, of course. And I think I was struck when I was in Erbil. It was not at all what I imagined it would be. It almost reminded me of Dubai or Las Vegas, actually, in terms of the buildings and the fluorescent lighting everywhere and things along those lines. And I think that's the thing about the region is that it has two very different realities. It's got the reality that we see on TV and what we're talking about today. And then it's got the reality on the ground of people living their lives and welcoming people and beautiful landscapes. And so it's a fascinating place that, has experienced a tremendous amount of pain and suffering. And we hope that at some point, some of that will change. And I do think one way or another, this war is going to change the landscape of the region. The big question is, what does that landscape look like into the future?
Yeah, I don't imagine there are too many hikers these days.
Not now. There were quite a few. Actually, a trip had just gone in late November, early December. And then we actually had what we were calling peace walks. So we had a peace walk between Arabs and Kurds on the Kurdistan path not long ago, actually probably about a week or two before the war broke out. And so we were bringing, former combatants together to walk, talk, and to understand and learn from each other.
Yeah, I wish we were doing more of this and less of what's going on right now. There are so many questions swirling about this war and what this war is actually about, particularly from the American perspective. Is it about supporting Israel in its desire to neutralize a regional threat? Is it preventing Iran from developing nuclear weapons? Access to Iranian oil and resources? Is it driven by Donald Trump's desire for world dominance? All of these things or something else? From your vantage point, what do you think?
I do think it is all of the above. I think those are all contributing factors to what's going on. I think that the U.S. support for Israel, I think particularly Trump, has been a staunch ally of Israel and was prepared to go down certain roads that other presidents had resisted for 47 years. I do think that in many places in the world, there's a lot of people who, have felt the sting of Iran's policies and governments and practices.
Including 20 or 30,000 people in a recent uprising.
Of course, yeah. So I think there's no love loss in many corners of the globe for the Iranian regime. And there's this question about whether things were imminent or not, whether there was that kind of a threat or not. From my point of view, my perspective is we are where we are, right? I think all of these things have played into this. I do think that there is a bit of a lack of clarity on what the goal is and how do we know, if you don't have a goal, if you don't have clear goalposts to aim for, then you don't know when you're finished. You don't know how to gauge success and things along those lines. As one of my colleagues put it, the goalpost is wherever the administration seems to want to kick the ball. And from a negotiation point of view, that's a problem because we don't really know what we're engaging with or talking about. And it's very hard to be specific about what an agreement would look like if you're not clear what you're trying to do. Is it doing away with nuclear capability? Is it regime change? Is it what? And I think also a really important piece of this is that this is not just the United States. Israel is obviously the other key player here. And I'm not at all convinced that the United States and Israel's objectives are aligned.
Yeah, there's a lot of doubt about that.
Yeah, and if in fact the United States and Iran were able to come up with an agreement, I think the U.S. has sort of proven in the last year or so that they are able to persuade Israel to do what they would like. On this one, I don't know, because I know that Netanyahu has had in his mind for a long time that this is the war that he sought, that for him and for Israel, true security, whether that's right or not, comes when there is no Iranian regime that is threatening the destruction of the state of Israel, right? So for him, I don't think there's any question what his objective is, but I get the sense that that's not really what Trump is after here. And then you also have to sprinkle in the fact that they're the Gulf states who have been, sort of drawn into this and have been pseudo allies of the United States, and they have different goals and objectives. So when you're negotiating all of this, this becomes exceedingly difficult, right? Because you're not aligned with your partners in what might ultimately be acceptable. The U.S. may decide they're going to reach some agreement and the other countries are going to have to come along or, do things on their own. It's unclear what that looks like.
And meanwhile, there were negotiations taking place in February, and they were also taking place last summer during the 12-day war when the U.S. and Israel targeted Iran's nuclear sites. I understand the talks were taking place in the UAE with Omani mediators. Who exactly was at the table, do you know?
Well, I certainly know that Witkoff and Kushner were at the table along with some British advisors. There's somebody who I've gotten to know who works closely with William named Jonathan Powell, who is in the British government, who was an advisor to the talks and recently wrote an account of what was on the table and things along those lines. I think on some level, it's a little bit unclear. The foreign minister from Iran was there, but it's a little bit unclear who else was there. A lot of the leadership has been killed. And so the question is who really speaks for Iran at this moment. That's not clear either. And whether there's alignment within on some of these things. The thing is, there's often a desire and an understandable one to reach an agreement and to to settle things down, to calm the situation. But one problem is that when you reach a bad agreement, an agreement where people are not aligned or they're not happy with the solution, what ends up happening is you're setting up the next phase of the conflict.
Exactly.
Right. And so
it's not a sustainable agreement.
Right. And I think that's the danger that we have to be aware of. Is it's not, can they reach an agreement? Can you really reach a lasting agreement that's going to take hold and it's not a temporary reprieve? And too often, I think that's what happens, is that people are understandably wanting this war to end. But, the question becomes, yes, it ends temporarily or whatever it might be, but what comes after? And I think that, to be very honest, history's, of course, a good teacher. And I believe that what happened in Iraq and what happened in Afghanistan, really need to be front and center in our way of thinking, because
absolutely,
we believed that we had won the war and that meant winning the peace, and they're very different. And what ends up happening is if you've got an ideology that underpins a system, which is what you have in Iran, that ideology doesn't go away. It sort of changes shape and changes form. And that's why, a military solution to this isn't really possible. There has to be some political agreement. And even then, you're going to have people that are going to be unhappy, that may go into the shadows and continue a guerrilla war like ISIS or others did after Iraq and Afghanistan.
I mean, do you think the talks were in good faith to begin with? I mean, there was some reporting that they were doomed from the start. If the negotiations weren't serious, were they just a placeholder while we got our ships and warplanes in position to attack?
I mean, it's always possible. I mean, I will say, and to your point about the progress that had been made in February, the account by Jonathan Powell was that both he and the Omani mediators felt like they were close to an agreement. It sounded to me like, from what I understood during those talks in February, Iran was prepared to have the deal be permanent, not for a period of time, that they had agreed to downblend their stockpiles and shift the way in which they were enriching their uranium from weapons grade for peaceful purposes. And in fact, there was even an economic dimension to this where the United States was going to be given a chance to participate in their civil nuclear program. And that all made good sense. And Iran was going to get 80% of their sanctions lifted. And because what Powell mentioned in the article was really that the Omani mediators believed that the zero stockpiling of highly enriched uranium offer meant that a breakthrough was pretty possible at that moment. So I'm not sure what the calculus was. I mean, again, I think you have to go back to what's the relationship here between the United States and Israel. Did Israel convince Trump that, even if you did these things, it still wouldn't change the fact that you had this theocratic regime that had done lots of things around the world, and that was what was really needed, not just degrading the nuclear capability?
Yeah. I mean, another insight that came from Ali Vaez, who's an expert at the International Crisis Group, was that the Iranians were proactively suggesting bargaining points, something they haven't done in previous negotiations. So what do people need to understand about Iran to get a better grasp of this conflict?
Well, I mean, I do think that there is a divide, and there has been a divide between the government and the people of Iran for a long time. By most estimates that I've seen, about 20 to 25% of the Iranian population supports the regime, which leaves quite a few people who don't, right? And I think that there's, as you mentioned, there's not freedom. There's brutal crackdowns that have occurred against their own people. So I think people need to understand that there is that divide. I also think they need to understand that a theocratic government based on devout religious principles is also the kind of thing that's not going to disappear overnight. No matter how many leaders you kill, that philosophy underpins the governing structures. And going forward, it's also, an interesting challenge about, let's imagine you did have regime change. What's that government going to look like? We thought in Iraq that a democracy would emerge, and it really didn't. And that notion in so many ways is a foreign concept, and one that has not been embraced in a lot of places across the region. So to think that all of a sudden that's going to happen is at best sort of wishful thinking, and at worst, we don't really know. But I can say that that system of theocracy is really entrenched, and how you might remove it is a very difficult question over the long term. People can make a commitment to do things differently, more openly, but those forces within aren't going to go anywhere easily.
Yeah. Looking at it on the plus side, I mean, I have a lot of Iranian relatives who left Iran when the Shah was deposed. And by and large, I mean, anybody who's been to Iran in the last few years, they come back raving about the country and the people and how genteel and nice they are. The on-the-ground perceptions of ordinary Iranians is they're smart, they are well-educated.
Yeah, and I think that poses a problem, a real challenge, because I think the internal dissent is real. And, the government has shown that they're willing to crack down and use an iron fist to keep people in line. So I don't think, and there are a lot of people in the United States who have immigrated from Iran who were applauding this effort because, as much as they may, I don't know what their views are about President Trump, that's for them to say, but they had no love lost for the regime. The regime had been brutal to their families and others. And so I think it's one of those kinds of things where you can understand the notion of trying to create the space for freedom. But, I think one of the interesting lessons of the Arab uprisings in the, late 2010s or early 2010s, I should say, was that it's one thing to rise up. It's another thing to govern. And I think what we saw in a lot of places was that their opposition emerged, overthrew dictatorial regimes, but nothing took their place. And as a result, you end up with sort of, I wouldn't say chaos, but you end up with not what I think a lot of people hoped for. And so it's one thing to be in opposition. It's another thing to be a governing party.
Right. They don't seem to be good at that. I don't know. I mean, from your perspective as a peace builder, I guess you would have advocated continuing the nuclear talks in February.
Well, certainly, if the kind of progress that is being reported was being made, then absolutely. Look, as somebody who works in this field and has worked in this field for a long time, rarely do military strikes and other kinds of efforts like this solve the problem. I'm in favor of the use of military force when there's genocide or things along those lines. But short of that, I believe that when there are avenues to peace and when there are avenues to a negotiated solution, we should always be pursuing those first. Because even if we don't, and even if we go to war and we succeed with our objectives, if people are bombed, if families are killed, they're not going to embrace you. It's pretty simple. It's not a hard lesson to learn. And yet somehow we think that that's the case, or a lot of parts of humanity believe that you can change these dynamics dramatically through the use of military force. And, I can think of perhaps one conflict, World War I, where a resounding defeat happened, but the vast majority of them, if not almost all of them, end at the negotiating table. So if they end there, why are we beginning elsewhere? Why don't we just stay and do the hard work of finding an agreement, especially when one is within reach and you can see that there is a level of seriousness, and I do think that you have to go into this. Iran has a track record of not always living up to the things they say they're going to do, as other places do. They're not the only one that does that. But I think that you absolutely have a trust and verify approach to things with this. And I think the JCPOA, the previous agreement in 2015 with Obama, had that. They had a series of verification measures, stringent verification measures. And
very stringent.
There was slippage on the part of Iran, but there was also quite a lot of what was transpiring that had been laid out and that Iran was sticking to. I think that's the challenge, but I'm always for more effort at the negotiating table, because the pain of war and conflict is something that doesn't go away in the near term. It sadly sets the stage for generations who have experienced that pain and anguish, and it sits with them. And again, like I said, sets up the next round of problems and challenges.
I mean, as a negotiator who wrote a book about restarting negotiations after a pause, what would you recommend?
If in fact they were as close as they were, if you were at a place back in February where you had the parameter of something really viable, what I would have recommended is go back to that. And instead of reinventing the wheel, let's use what had already been agreed to. And if there were some sticking points, figure out how to come at those differently. But typically what I try to do in terms of recommendations for getting back to the table is really to say what worked. Don't throw away what you've already accomplished, but then think about what didn't work and how can you come at the problem differently in that regard. So if there were some sticking points, what are some creative ways of getting around that? You've had the ability to kind of step back now for a couple of months and to think about where you are. And so try to take a different angle at some of these things. And look, some of the facts on the ground have changed as a result of the war. And so some of those issues may very well have already been dealt with. And, nuclear programs set back to a point where, if anything, it would take quite a bit longer to get to that place. And so some of these pieces that might have been problematic might have advanced through other means, like is probably the best way I can put it.
How can mediators adapt their strategy in the age of Trump 2.0, or should they?
I think for mediators in this reality, you have to recognize what you're dealing with from a negotiation point of view, right? That Trump's approach tends to be a very forceful one and using all the power that's at his disposal, right? And so as a mediator, part of the challenge, I think, is to make sure that any agreement isn't something that one side is really being forced into in a manner that's going to set up that next round of conflict that I talked about. And if I imagine that the Omanis are, doing some shuttle diplomacy with the Iranians and saying, look, if you're going to agree to this kind of thing, you really need to own it and live with it. And so be careful and think that through before you say yes. You don't want to just say yes to alleviate the pain if we're going to just end up back here again. So I do think a mediator's approach shifts a bit. And you also have to understand that if one side is coming on very strongly using a very forceful negotiation approach, I think part of your job is to temper that and to try to figure out how do we reframe some of these conversations so that the other side can actually hear what you're saying and maybe focus on the underlying interests as opposed to the threats and the bluster and things like that. We talk a lot about the goals of the US and Israel and things like that. But, for Iran, it's an interesting question too of what are your goals beyond survival? Because they're facing that kind of existential threat. And there is a question about, do they know what they're really seeking at the negotiating table? A lot of times I'm fascinated because I do a lot of advising and coaching for parties that are going to be negotiating or are in the middle of negotiations. And one of the things that I always find interesting is the parties are often very unclear about what it is that they're trying to achieve. And so they have to work internally on their own perspectives on things. And I would add, by the way, that we make the mistake that we believe parties are monoliths, that the Iranians are at the table. Well, there's a whole spectrum of views. We just talked about the distinction between the government and the people, right? I think what would be acceptable to the people on the ground is very different than what would be acceptable to government. And when you get in there and there are hardliners who say, if you agree to that, we're going underground, we're going to wage a guerrilla warfare, so don't do it, right? A lot of the times you have, constituents in negotiation. And the question is, are your constituents going to follow whatever you agree or not? And that's a difficult one. And it happens a lot where, you have this wide array of views. And I think in those instances, what you're really trying to do is you're trying to get 75% of the people to go along with you. That's a win.
Right. That's a win.
And you're not going to get the hardliners who are focused on the destruction of the United States and Israel. Like, it's not going to happen. And so the question is, can you manage with, 3/4 of the population, if you can get that, supporting what you're doing and trying to work your way through. And I think the other caution that I would just put out there for people to think about is when people and parties reach an agreement in a negotiation, that's the beginning of the end. It's not the end. the implementation is critical.
Absolutely critical. And nobody pays sufficient attention to that.
When it's all about expectations, that's the problem, right? That when we reach an agreement, everybody says, oh, thank God it's over. And it's like, hang on a minute. Like, nobody's done anything differently other than agree. Like, this is going to require the actual implementation. And it's also going to require parties ceasing bombing and ceasing doing certain things. And again, this is where we come back to, are your allies and partners aligned? Because if the United States says, hey, we've reached an agreement with Iran and Israel bombs them the next day, well, what's going to happen there, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
You're not going to make much progress. So I'm hoping that his advisors and then others are saying to him, hey, here's how you declare victory. Here's how you stop now. Here's how you go home with the ability to say, look what I did, et cetera. Right. And I think that's what he needs. I mean, most people need that in negotiation. They need to go back in negotiation. We often talk about the victory speech and people being able to give that victory speech to their constituents. Trump needs to do that. And whether people want to hear this or not, so do the Iranians. If they're going to agree to something, they're going to need to say, we were able to preserve this, this, and this.
We're always interested in looking at this from a media standpoint. And I think it was last week, Shamal Idris was on he's a well-known peace builder.
Good friend.
Head of the largest peace-building organization in the world, was on CNN. That is such a rare occurrence. I mean, we're used to hearing pundits and military advisors, and we so rarely hear the kind of perspective that you represent, or that Shamal represents. It's really unfortunate.
It's not only unfortunate, but it's also, the way in which negotiation is often characterized in these kinds of scenarios is weakness. And it's not weakness. It's the height of courage, in my mind, to sit across from quote unquote your enemy and to work through something so that more people don't die. That's courageous. It is. There's nothing weak about it. And I think the problem is that, to your point, Jamil, we don't talk about this nearly enough. I think our field in general has failed at our messaging and our ability to be out there and saying, hey, there are other ways of trying to deal with this problem. And so the populace quickly believes that, hey, we should just be taking military action here without giving diplomacy the best chance. And, the interesting thing is that when you talk to, the biggest proponents of diplomacy are the military, because they know how horrible destructive conflict and war is. And so when I talk to them, they always say, listen, we want you guys in the diplomatic realm to do your thing. And we want war and the use of military force to be the very last stop on the train. And we should really be investing more and more in these efforts to try to handle these kinds of problems, because nobody wins. You can claim victory, but nobody wins from this. And I know people listening to this will say, well, that's not true. We were able to stop Iran. Yes, but you also have to take into consideration the long game. And if you want a stable Middle East, it has to come at the negotiating table. I'm sorry, but people don't quite, for whatever reason, they resist that notion. But that is where this happens, because in the end, people might have to come to the table because of the bombs and the pain and things that they're experiencing. But if they don't have a say in their future, that kind of security will not last.
Right. That's the thing. I mean, the search for a durable peace agreement really should be paramount. I don't think we appreciate that.
No, we don't. And what's interesting is people will say to me, yeah, but that stuff never works. I'm like, I'm sorry. Have you heard of Northern Ireland? Have you heard of Colombia? Have you heard of South Africa? Have you heard of Mozambique? Have you heard of El Salvador? This is the thing, is that people are unaware. And, years ago, a woman reached out to me who was doing a podcast, and it was called Peace is Sexy. And she said, do you want to come on? And I said, absolutely. And she said to me, why did you agree to come on? And I said, because your messaging is exactly right. This stuff is far more interesting.
Right.
Yeah. And this work is far more interesting. It's far more challenging. It's far more dramatic than the vast majority of people understand. And I think we need to be better at helping people to understand why this is so important, what goes into this work, and the successes that have been had, so that people say, hey, give this a chance. And all you have to do is talk to somebody who's been involved in a war, who's lost a family member, and who says, I'll never forgive and I'll never forget. And you think, okay, so the next generation of people are doomed to more pain and more anguish.
Can you envision a negotiated end to this war? I mean, what might that look like?
As we've been talking about, I can envision it. My biggest question, and it does sound like there's been some good movement, right, toward this. My biggest question and my biggest concern in that is that you have a number of different interests. I just saw a story yesterday that MBS from Saudi Arabia was pushing the Trump administration to keep fighting.
Yes, I saw that.
I think the Gulf states, are saying, hey, we're vulnerable, stop, right? Israel is saying, we're going to keep going. We're going to open a new front. We've opened a new front with Hezbollah to degrade that threat. We still have the question of the Palestinians in Gaza and what happens there. So the worry that I have is that you have all these other players that are not at the table and that their interests aren't really being necessarily taken into consideration.
Yeah, they're not aligned.
Yeah, so that's my worry. I think that you can probably reach an agreement that gives each side an ability to move forward. But these other actors are the challenge that I see. Netanyahu is really focused on regime change and doing away with all of these threats that have surrounded Israel for a long time. And, if Trump stops short of that, it's quite possible that Israel says, look, thanks, but we're going to keep going because that's what our national interest is and tells us.
This is a tough question, but how do you recommend listeners keep up with developments in the Iran war so that they're getting credible information and not be driven insane,
It is a tough question. I agree with you. To be very frank, I actually have shifted away from U.S. sources primarily for my own knowledge. I primarily rely on the BBC because I feel like they put out different perspectives on all of this. The BBC is good at saying, here's what the U.S. is really trying to get at, and here's where it seems like Israel differs, and here's what the Iranian people are saying, and here's what the Iranian government is talking about. I think that's what you want.
I think that's exactly right. We need to see all of the different perspectives and recognize it's not monolithic.
First of all, I would absolutely say be very skeptical of the social media piece of this, and I've even fallen victim to that myself, right? Where I saw a story and thought it was real and kind of went with that and then came to realize that it wasn't. And so I think we have to be very careful about that. I would very much sort of say to folks, I think you should steer clear of that, of the social media piece of this in terms of learning about this, et cetera. But try to pick a channel or a station that is going to provide you with these different vantage points, because that is the reality. It's never all black and white. There are lots of shades of gray that people need to understand that are part of these conflicts.
Well, Josh, I really appreciate your insights today. Is there anything I didn't ask you or anything you'd like to share in addition to what we've talked about?
Well, the only thing I would say is, if I'm going to try to be a possibilist, like my friend William Ury talks about,
right.
I do think that at the end of the day, this will change the landscape of the Middle East. The question is, what's it going to look like? But it may be that there's an opportunity for, regional entities to come together and work together after this. I don't know, but I think that there may be an opportunity and an opening, and I would want to close on that point that the Middle East is changing without question, and one can hope that with some guidance from countries around the world, that perhaps there can finally be a different reality for the people there who have suffered so much. I think you can hold out the hope that some of these relationships have begun to change, and if we can get to a place where the vast majority of the region is able to kind of collaborate, create an economic zone, a security zone, things like that. I don't see a clear path to that either. But, as the old Chinese symbol of within crisis, there's opportunity. And I'm hoping that at the end of the day, there may be some coalescing around things that might be more productive for the region.
Well, as they say in the Middle East, inshallah.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Josh. I really appreciate your insights.
You're most welcome, Jamil. Thanks for having me on. It was always a pleasure, my friend.
As I mentioned at the top, we recorded my conversation with Josh Weiss on March 25th. Since then, there have been some developments. Notably, Egypt, Turkey, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia are now involved as intermediaries in potential peace talks. We followed up with Josh on Monday, March 30th, and he wrote to us with some more thoughts. Josh said that any efforts towards negotiation should be welcome. He noted that Egypt, Turkey, and Pakistan lean towards Iran's views on the war. Saudi Arabia, Josh said, provides a counterbalance, and the U.S. will feel comfortable using the Saudis as an intermediary. Another positive to involving Saudi Arabia is that it's a powerful country with influence over Trump. Also, the Saudis have expressed interest in normalizing relationships with Israel if there's a clear path to a Palestinian state. That option would point to a regional agreement, including Israel. But Josh still thinks there's a good chance the United States will make a deal with Iran without Israel. He sees Netanyahu's goal as regime change in Iran. Making Peace Visible is produced by Andrew Maraskin. The associate producer is Faith McClure, and I'm Jamil Simon. If you found this episode interesting, or maybe it gave you a little more hope than you had before, please share it with someone who cares about peace in the Middle East. An easy way to do that is to take a screenshot of your podcast player and send it in a text or WhatsApp message. If you have another minute or two, it will mean a lot to us if you could rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts, or leave a rating and comment on Spotify. It really helps bring more attention to what we're doing. Thanks for listening, and talk soon.